Uh, Growing up in Guatemala has always been a common thing to hear about migration, and even once my dad thought about migrating to the United States. But when everything really started is when I was about 9 years old, and I got to meet Baltazar. He used to sell chicken right in this street, very close to my house, and he had been deported 5 times from the United States. He had failed 5 times. And my mom asked him, why haven't you applied for a visa? And let me tell you, he didn't even know there was such thing. He didn't know there was a legal way to cross the border. So he filled out his paperwork. He went to the embassy and got it. He was very lucky, and he got the visa. But of course, not everyone has the same luck. This experience has been like pressing in my mind for a long period of time, and it really makes me think about one question that is really often ignored, and we don't really ask ourselves. There's an emphasis on deportation techniques, separation of families, an emphasis on the challenges that people without documents face here of living here and working at the same time. But we don't really ask ourselves what happens after this person gets deported. So last spring, 2 other team members who are sitting in the audience and us started working on a project that could take action to help out my fellow countrymen. And we end up with the Migrant Peace Building and Reconciliation Project. This project seeks to provide sustainable opportunities for Guatemalan migrants who have been deported from the United States.
Sitting here in the climate-controlled Diamond Building, it can be pretty easy to see this issue from only one perspective, and to assume that when faced with deportation, a migrant simply returns to his home, returns to his family, and resumes life as normal. But of course, it's not that simple. This is something I had the opportunity to see for myself when I spent several weeks in Guatemala this past December doing some preliminary research. The first question to ask ourselves is, why did the migrant leave in the first place? The answer is the push of high rates of underemployment and crime, and the pull of the promise of better security and better wages in the United States. To give you a picture of some of the economic and social conditions facing many of the migrants who come from Guatemala, it's helpful to know that Guatemala is ranked as the 11th most unequal country in the world, and that 83% of the migrants come from rural areas where poverty is most prominent and persistent. But even these statistics don't reflect the full range of problems they face, mainly violence and crime, brought on not only by high rates of poverty, but also the US-fueled drug trade, for which Guatemala serves as a central transit point for both laundered money and illicit drugs on the way to markets in the US. These conditions have driven an exodus of workers from Guatemala, despite the life-threatening barriers they face en route. For example, crossing the Sonora Desert in Mexico takes 5 days, and many die from dehydration or lack of food. But despite these barriers, every year thousands make the trek. So many that 1 out of every 10 Guatemalan nationals lives outside of the country. And 98% of them, or 1.3 million people, are right here in the US. This number is so large that the Guatemalan economy relies heavily on remittances from these migrants. Over 10% of its GDP is constituted by them. This money usually goes back to their family to pay for housing, healthcare, education, and community development. But over half of these migrants are living here without documentation. And every year, tens of thousands are deported. And every year, this number only rises.
When a migrant returns involuntarily to Guatemala, nothing has really changed. Poverty and crime are still there. Those 2 things are a really important part of every person that lives in Guatemala, are a huge factor. And what has changed now is that they are an outsider. They have become alienated, and they are disconnected from the systems of support on which all people rely. And not only they come back without a job, without all the connections they once made, but they are leaving behind work, friends, family, everything they achieved in the United States. So if we really think about this, it's something we don't really ask ourselves really often. They are now alienated. And what happens here is that now the migrant is a foreigner in his own country. They come back to the communities where they used to live, and things have really changed. So what can we do to make this situation something better? The stigmas related to deportation can be just as debilitating as the bewildering and dehumanizing experience of being dragged onto an airplane and taken to a place that has now become unfamiliar. They are now a deportado, a so-called lawbreaker, someone that didn't achieve goals and fell to himself and his family. These stigmas can manifest themselves in many forms. For example, right there in the communities where they used to live, and perhaps the most visual example of this are tattoos. In the United States, it's very common to see someone with a tattoo. It has become something pretty common to see every day around. And many migrants that come here to the United States may have become a bit Americanized, and they have probably gotten a tattoo as well. But in Guatemala, a tattoo means only one thing most of the times, and that's gang membership. A Guatemalan with a tattoo cannot simply walk in the streets and get a job, cannot simply walk in the streets without the fear of being stigmatized. I cannot simply sift back into society that effectively. Of course, not every migrant comes back with a tattoo. Not every migrant comes back with a tattoo. But this is just a very concrete visual representation of the process that could hold back a migrant. On the other hand, it reflects the burden they all carry when they step off the plane and find out that in most cases no one is waiting for them. Authorities often do nothing but just write down their names, and they have to leave the airport right away. If they were lucky, they were able to call their family, so they came to pick them up. If not, they'll be willing to give anything. A watch, sunglasses, a couple dollars, even a pair of shoes. Anything that probably the taxi driver liked. So these migrants left because of the lack of opportunities, and now, stigmatized and dislocated, their chances are even fewer.
From the surface, our plan is relatively simple. Connect people. Through the contacts we've made within the Guatemalan business, academic, and nonprofit communities, we are uniquely poised to help connect deported migrants with employers. By doing so, we hope to not only help these folks find jobs, but also to undermine and challenge the stigmas dragging them down. So this coming summer, we plan to travel to Guatemala to implement a 3-step program: connect, educate, and implement. Connecting requires working in 2 different directions. First, we need to reach out to members of the business community in order to find employers willing to hire migrant workers. This is basically an exercise in networking, as we need to talk to as many people as possible, whether they're involved in media, business, nonprofit, or academia, to get our message out there and find potential partners. Now, this seems like a pretty hard thing to do, and it is. But we've already made considerable headway in contacting and securing the support of partners, including not only businessmen, but also a volunteer legal team who will help deported migrants get the proper Guatemalan documentation they need, as many are sent home without any of that. The flip side of this phase of our project is to get into contact with deported migrants. Now, this is the more challenging piece. But by reaching out to groups within Guatemala and by talking to leaders of the Guatemalan diaspora here in the United States, we can find these people. And perhaps the most effective way is to simply spend that time outside on the streets of Guatemala City talking to folks. For example, this past December, while we were at a store in the city, a security guard overheard us speaking in English. So he approached us, struck up a conversation, and told us that he had lived in Chicago for some time, where he had a job as a cook. With that job, he was able to make enough money to support his family back at home. But then he was deported. And when he got back to Guatemala, he couldn't find work as a cook because he had no way of proving his work experience from the States. What he told us is that if he hadn't known the owner of the store he was currently working at before he had migrated, he would be in serious trouble. He'd be out of work or painfully underemployed. That's probably the most important point to listen to in this whole presentation. If he hadn't known the owner, he wouldn't have a job. That's the essence of our plan, to connect deported migrants with employers such as these.
The second stage is educate. While we're reaching out to both potential employers and deported migrants, it is also very important to reach out to the academic community in Guatemala. With them, we will discuss about the problems that deported migrants face and find out how to challenge these stigmas dragging them down. We also want to raise awareness about our efforts and raise funds. By undermining the stigmas and humanizing the problems, we will be able to shift the perception of the next generation of Guatemalan leaders to be more open to this problem, to these people. We have already made a substantial and a very solid progress in reaching out to both professors and university teachers in Guatemala. We have gone to many campuses around the city and in rural areas, and they're willing to help to spread the word and host talks. As of now, one research team is already carrying out research on this target population and carrying out surveys to identify the specific stigmas that are dragging deported migrants down.
The final phase of our plan for this summer is to simply put all the pieces together. We plan to work with deported migrants that we've contacted in order to verify their job experiences and help them navigate the legal processes to getting the proper Guatemalan documentation. We also plan to provide formal clothing, transportation, and training for job interviews so that they can work on getting themselves employed. Finally, we will host a job fair, bringing together businessmen who've pledged their support and migrants who we've prepared into one room to connect employer with employee. By doing this, we hope to not only help these folks find jobs, but also to put an employer face-to-face with a migrant who we'll see has value as an employee, is a productive member of the labor force, and is a misunderstood member of society who deserves respect.
Our long-term goal is to see this project grow into a self-sustaining organization, institutionalized as an NGO. But for now, we're being realistic. We're thinking about the present, and we know that if we reach Guatemala with enough resources and the support we need, we'll be able to create a good difference. We'll be able to create a good impact, a positive one. Migrants are victims of a systemic failure that doesn't provide them enough support to stand on their feet again. By getting together, deported migrants, employees, and academics together, we will be able to create a self-sustaining network that will go a long way towards creating and addressing the systemic failure that are affecting deported migrants. It will go a long way, and we truly believe we can make a difference. So I invite you to check out our website, migrantpeacebuilding.webs.com, and our Facebook page as well. I encourage you to get involved in the initiative, think about what we're doing, and participate, spread the word. Remember that migrants are victims of an economic system that doesn't give them hope, and another one that promises too much. Thank you.